Before we kick off, of course, I would like to recognize the traditional owners of the land which we're coming together right now and pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to Signature Project Agile Trust. And trust is one of those big topics that gets a lot of attention. And despite all the intensity of the conversation, especially in a corporate context, is still poorly understood. And that mix between trust matters and trust is poorly understood as a design variable in a corporate context motivated our whole Signature project. Today we go even more in a specific area and do not just ask ourselves, what is trust? How we build and manage it, we ask ourselves, how can it be governed? And I don't think in the world a lot of people think about trust governance right now. And again, that characterized a bit of work we want to do. Big, influential, but unique pieces of work. So the more we find places where, based on the question already, what is trust governance, there's a big gap between us and the rest, the more we have an advantage. If you compete on the answer in search of a response to a common question, it's much harder. So in your PhD work, in your postdoctoral research, wherever, if you create a sort of competitive advantage already in the question, you have a head start. And I think that's what we have right now. So it comes down to building the perfect answer. By now, you all know Adela, who joined us as a postdoc, has her fingers everywhere, and also builds a global product. And you will talk about it, no doubt, but the idea of not just conducting research, but talking about it. My supervisor always said, Michael, do great work and talk about it. A lot of people compromise on one of those two elements. We try not to compromise, but get the most out of both. And you will also hear from Adela how quite creatively you touch on both items. So with this, warm welcome to Adela. Again, highly interactive. Don't hold back on your questions because only collectively we create this a better piece of work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. So today I will speak about, as Michael well introduced, about the trust governance. So this is the study we started when we recognized there is a very important trend happening in the world, which is governance of trust, not only management. And governance, I know many like to define it as management of management. So there is something happening. They realize it is so important not only to be managed. So as you can see, the title is Trust Governance, How the Global Companies Govern and Manage Trust. And these are early insights from the ongoing studies.
Yeah, now you use it, it will work now.
Now it works.
Yeah,
good.
You have to do that.
So it's about position.
Yeah.
As Michael said, I would like to acknowledge traditional owners of this land. That was always the land of learning and education. I just wanted, before I jump directly into trust governance, to include this framework of SP3. As you can see in our question, how to manage trust, we have included that governance as a management of management, design, how to measure trust and retain trust. Our focus of discussion today would be, how do we govern trust? Now you might think about this, what is trust governance? I heard about trust governance in accounting and finances, and there's the governance of the trust bond. But what is this when we speak about relationships and trust in the context of, do I trust this product? Do I trust this company? Do I trust these people to sell me something? So we recognize that industry is having new recognition of trust. They ask, who is in charge of trust? And if you think about it, in all companies, if you ask who is in charge for trust in your company or in that company, everyone will say, okay, it's partially my responsibility and it's partially everyone's responsibility, but no one is accountable. As long as you don't have one person accountable, you don't have that progress in understanding trust, because it's nobody's fault if this trust happens or if trust building techniques are not working toward your profits and financial outcomes. So what if there is one professional in charge of trust management and trust management of management governance called Chief Trust Officer? And before I joined QUT, Michael and Chelsea were working really hard on this. They actually identified these 6 companies having Chief Trust Officer that's not funding trust officer, but actually in charge for trust in these 6 companies. What I did, I tried to actually go to them to analyze their secondary resources, to reach out directly to them and to see what is actually trust governance and what is just data governance of privacy or security officer. This resulted in figuring out that Yahoo in the meanwhile didn't develop this position. They went into the different direction. And I will tell you why in a bit. And Microsoft has 0 trust officer, which is more about trust retention, protection, and prevention of negative events than governing exactly comprehensively trust. Then also what happened in Airbnb, Airbnb had a chief trust officer that very scandalously, quite publicly resigned due to the conflict with the other CEO, C-suite members. And he is today working for PwC. This is a very interesting character. He's actually a former FBI agent. So he has really, really strict understanding of trust governance. He wasn't willing to bend for any organization. So I actually contacted all of them. Airbnb has a position in place that's similar to this, but it's more focused on partnership development than comprehensive development of trust governance. These efforts resulted in direct 90-minute interview with Amazon and about 60 minutes with SAP. And now what we have here, out of 5 organizations that actually have a chief trust officer in the world, we have 40%. We have 2 out of 5. In the world, no one else is doing this. And we also have secondary data, their role descriptions they sent me, as well as additional reports, insights, and publicly available information from their annual reports, media releases, and interviews they gave previously, either to scientific organizations that made it public, either for educational online purposes or to media. To media is more catchy and superficial, you would expect that. This resulted, Michael mentioned this as part of analyzing my interviews. Just before I did that, I also developed TrustCast. This is the way how we outreach to the public about all activities in SP3, all activities we are doing in researching trust at QUT. You can see, you can listen to it in different platforms. Episode 1 with Entut was published in April, and episode with Elena Kvochko was just published yesterday, and we advertise it. So I'm inviting you to go to LinkedIn to actually listen to the episodes. They are 20 minutes long, so drive or walk home. And they are really interesting, not only in terms of research, but I made the content more interesting to general public. They actually speak about future trends as well. So this was about the way we research and way we promote research. Now let's go to early findings. This is something I am still developing. So early findings show that actually chief trust officer or trust governor, however we call it, is acting as part of board, so part of C-suite. But they're also having their external part of action, their direct connection between board and managers and their teams, different teams. And under these teams, we have development team, development of product and service. We have sales team, feedback team, and many more. So codes are still emerging. When we speak about interaction of CTO and the board, they actually have collaborative goal setting. They sit together and establish performance goals and goals of the actions taken by CTO together. And then when CTO reports on performance, they are actually referring to those goals they established together. Interaction between CTO and managers is actually collaborative implementation to reach these goals. So they are speaking with managers of teams in order, what should they do and how should they act in order to reach goals set by the board and CTO? And how is CTO doing their role? They are ensuring trust is built and maintained via transparency, data privacy and security, product service quality. You can expect that from development teams. Customer support, that's definitely consumer relationship team. Feedback implementation through feedback teams. etc. Now these are, but interesting thing is that they also said, what I noticed in listening to their interviews and analyzing secondary data is that they have no idea how is this impacting their profits. They say, we don't measure success anymore only by profits and losses, but we measure success also with trust and ethics. So they don't know, do they put that trust before the profit? Is trust affecting profit? They didn't know how to do that. So they only put trust on the level of their other KPIs of good performance, which is a huge gap in literature, of course. Additional stuff here, as you can see, they're actually acting on consumer feedback. So whenever something's lacking or could use improvement, the CTO would learn about that from the feedback team, digest it in relation to these goals they set collaboratively with the C-suite, and then discuss with the development team, how could this be improved in the future to build stronger trust. They also develop policies for the everything enlisted on the right side. This is what we have so far, so I'm open to your question. Yes?
Can you give us the definition of trust?
Of trust?
Yeah. Good question.
Good question. We're just speaking about trust. Trust in general is the level of certainty you have that somebody will do what they're committing to do. But that's so complex, and there are so many other dimensions that we cover and discuss here. Yes, Caroline?
I'm just wondering, as you know, Adela, we're studying corporate social responsibility.
Yes.
And I see the word trust come through repeatedly. Have you had any reflection on within companies or your general understanding of it, whether or not there's a direct nexus between trust and successful outcomes of corporate social responsibility initiatives?
They didn't mention that at all in the interview. They said that's part of trust building, but they didn't actually mention, as I said, they don't know the impact between trust and the financial outcome of the company. But then how they treat corporate social responsibility or social policies and environmental friendly policies is that they see it as one of the departments they collaborate with. So that's one piece of a puzzle in entire trust governance.
Okay.
So I think Janine was next, sorry.
Thank you. Could you put up your overhead when you have the dot points for trust?
It's just a
Sorry
bit.
to do that.
This one? Next one? Okay.
In my mind, I was wondering, trust is such an amorphous kind of thing. You know it when you see it, but you can't, it's really hard to define. Those dot points there, you're saying that that's what they're using to measure or keep an eye on or finger on the pulse of trust?
To build trust.
To build
They
trust.
see this as elements of trust, of what are they governing. So they, for example, these are only preliminary emerging codes I have from the analysis. But what they say about transparency, SAP says transparency is your vehicle driving trust. If there's no vehicle, there's no trust, definitely. But transparency is actually communicating what you are doing, and what you're doing is important part as well. But if it's not publicly released and accessible to everyone, then you have an issue. Data privacy and security, they say this comes on top of your product quality. That's why you collaborate with your development team. If your product is not doing what it should be doing, you cannot trust it because it's not doing what you promised it will do. Exactly. And then in addition to that, if you don't feel safe using that product because you think information about your usage is going to go out or be public, then we have another trust issue, and that's coming only as an additional layer to product quality. This is something we discussed today. You had access to that information early.
So what I was thinking is that you need something to work with if you're going to measure trust. And you're talking there with feedback from on goals and goal setting and so on. So they must be able to measure each of these. And I was just curious as to how you measure transparency and how you measure data privacy and how, you know, like, could you comment about how possible that is and to what extent they're successful in doing that?
You'll be surprised. So when I ask them, how do you measure KPIs of your success? How do you measure performance in your role? How do you know you're doing the right thing here?
Exactly.
How do you know not only right, but useful for your company,
right.
not you losing your time on building trust that's not going to be utilized at all? They said, we're doing all we can and hoping it will have good results. So that's the answer.
Trust from whom? Did they actually identify
Consumer.
target consumers? All right, so that narrow it down.
Did the question come from where?
I think I have one old. Anna, you had questions just before.
Something actually building upon what Artemis is saying, because you've mentioned that the way how they measure the success is to look at the profit and loss plus trust and ethics.
Yes.
And trust is such a big, you know, construct. And I was thinking, what is it like trust in how users perceive the trust in a product?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a trust in the company? Is it the employees' trust in the company? Is it more all of the above?
I agree. And one of my questions was, well, internal trust must be important because if we speak about coming as a one team and being consistent in your message you're sending to consumer in every point of touch with consumer, you must speak about that internally. But they say that's regulated by company policy and leadership principles, for example, in Amazon and Alexa. But what we focus on is this trust consumer has in our products. And trust in products.
Trust in a product.
Exactly. And that is affected by their reputation, by their interaction, by all the other factors that come in and impact in.
Okay, yeah. And I think in your framework, it would be good to define that this is the consumer, that you are looking specifically and
the unit of analysis, yeah.
Of trust.
The unit of analysis. Yeah,
Yes, the unit of analysis, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I agree.
Thank you, Adela, for the presentation. My question is, to what extent this trust concept is limited to just a public relationship or reputational risk management? Well, instead of
So the question was, to what extent is PR, public relation, connected to creating shared value?
Yeah, the concept of trust is limited by the reputational risk management and public relationships, just that.
Definitely, there is connection, and that's what I tried to clarify from the beginning of the interview and research, to make sure these are not just PR positions that already exist for ages. And what they said is that they are actually the ones giving information to PR. So they are in charge completely for trust, but then there is somebody else in charge to communicate that. And that's where this transparency comes to, from the slide. I was their slide. That's actually driving their trust, but that's one of the departments they collaborate with. That's just a part of it.
I just, because I just finished a coursework in governance, and well, sometimes you even just have the CEO as part of the board, but not the rest of the executive suite, or it's even excluding the CEO. So I would be careful to see if there's CTO is actually part of the board or just sits on the board as part of the C-suite and corresponds with the board. Because we have different constellations. I don't know if you found that the CTO is part of the board now or as an internal director.
They're actually working as part of the board, but actually more communicating with other departments. That's why I put them on the verge.
Yeah.
Communicating with other managers than any other member.
Awesome.
Thank you, that's good.
A couple of questions. Did you find out how these roles came into being? Like, what was the trigger? How long have they been in existence?
That's very interesting. Researching literature and news online and secondary data before I actually got access to these people in Silicon Valley, I was thinking that environmental changes and increase of uncertainty in general, globalization, technology development, natural disasters, that triggered these roles. However, when I spoke with Anne Tooth in the first episode, she told me, I invented the role. So 10 years ago, they needed somebody, she was working for Yahoo. She was, and that's the one I told you I'll tell you about. She was the one working in Yahoo, and then she left, and that's how Yahoo lost CTO. They never again invented the same position. They decided to go only in direction of data governing, so privacy governance. She was invited to work for Yahoo by a previous colleague who told her, look, we have so much data. We don't know what to do with it. We have data from the feedback from the consumers. We have data about this and that. And it would be amazing if somebody knows how to do with it, how to process it, how to collaborate like with the board and actually implement findings. And he asked her, would you be privacy chief officer for privacy? And she took time to think about it. And then she said, no, we will name the position chief trust officer, not chief privacy officer. Because first, when you say privacy, everyone's thinking about the things they're doing and they don't want you to know. So it's very negative connotation. And second, because she wanted to expand from only data and privacy concerns to the all trust that matters in the company. She wasn't able to do that efficiently in Yahoo, and that's why she transferred later on to Alexa, and she's doing that today.
So another question I have is, how did you identify the existence of these roles? What was the approach? Because I'm not sure if it was you or some pre-work that was done.
I spoke with Chelsea about it. So they noticed that this is happening as a trend. They didn't even know and was there for 10 years. Almost nobody know. Only recently in 2020, SAP decided to open Chief Trust Office. And then they hired Elena Kvočko from the second episode. They brought her to SAP and told her, okay, set up the office. And she was actually following example from the N and others.
I think your question was, how did we identify them?
Exactly.
So we did, are you?
Yeah, I'm getting there. Sorry. So they actually searched through LinkedIn or Chief Trust Officer, but then Chelsea also looked in the position description and the employment status in terms of which company is employing them and what is their purpose. So there was many Chief Trust Officers that were working in public institutions or in banks governing trust fund.
So the answer is LinkedIn search Chief Trust Officer and then filter those out who are hardcore privacy only. The questions. Sorry, can we just show two questions online? Maybe Philip and then Kevin, please. Give us on 1 second.
First one is age of trust. Oh,
so Philip,
can you scroll down?
This
is the long one.
Is it still there? And if it is, go on. Then maybe over to Kevin.
Vibur asked first, is age of trust and extreme trust are two sides of trust scale? Vibur, can you explain this question, please?
While we wait for Vib, can I head over to Kevin?
Yes. Kevin, would you ask a question?
Sure, thank you. So excellent presentation, I enjoyed it. So as you were describing the role of the Chief Trust Officer and how they coordinate along with the board and so on and so forth, that seems fairly traditional to any other chief XO, like chief knowledge officers, chief learning officers, chief privacy. And so all of these chiefs came about due to different instances of time, right? And so a while back, Tom Davenport and I were looking at chief knowledge officers when individuals were talking about intellectual property and all, and soon after that it became learning officers and then privacy officers. Now, if you go into most organizations, they actually do not have chief knowledge officers. They don't have chief learning officers, so on and so forth. So what is different about chief trust officers, or in like 3 years, are we not going to see any chief trust officers?
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Kevin. So their vision of the future is that this role will evolve and become even stronger and more comprehensive. right now they feel they went from data privacy and security and evolved to capture that consumer trust in terms of even sales and after-sales service and product quality, and they're continuously feeding their actions from the feedback of the consumer who's actually feeding the company with the money. So what they see in future happening, they see more going into the direction of ethics, emphasizing what is right to do, but they're actually not so focused on the outcome. I think they strongly believe the outcome is there as long as you are doing what's right to do, not only what you tell you will be doing. So that's the hygienic factor. Do what you told you will do. But on top of that, do what's right, and then also broadcast it. So I think that's their main direction. They both spoke about it very heavily.
Yeah, but my question was, so right now, if you ask most organizations, why do they not have a chief knowledge officer or a chief learning officer? And if you examine the articles where beyond the core C-suite, that is the CEO, the CFO, chief marketing, legal, and most recently, the only one that has remained is the chief information officer. Every other C that has tried to play a major role has only lasted a few years. And so it may be interesting for you to look at why haven't chief knowledge officers retain their role when clearly right now everybody competes on knowledge and innovation. Why most companies don't have learning officers. So all of these roles were prominent at one point in time. And I'm happy to share with you articles offline of things we wrote on chief knowledge officers, learning officers and all, but none of those roles remain. And so one way to really differentiate your work is to find out what do you think will make this role more permanent than any of the others, or at least why would a chief trust officer get a seat on the board? Because until that point in time, it's just one of these roles that is reactionary, as you noted, to external events, but any of those roles that are reactionary do not last for more than a couple of years.
It's very interesting. Please share those papers with me. I would love to see them. And as a comment, just additional comment, 10 years is how long role of N-TOT lasted. So there must be difference, and thank you for pointing that out. I'll definitely compare it.
Thanks, Kevin. I think we also have to ask, is the title of your presentation the role of the Chief Trust Officer or trust governance? And they're probably very different questions. There was someone else here somewhere. Anna.
Anna?
Yes, I have a question and sub-question. So one would be, how do you now define trust governance based on the data that you've collected? And sort of follow-up question is, even if there is no role of chief trust officer any longer in the organization, I wonder whether you've looked at examples of organizations and their, say, mission statements or strategic directions or key values, whether the trust was included in those, and if so, how is it being governed if it's there in a mission or vision, or in the vision of the organization? If trust is evident and explicitly mentioned, you might assume that organization does something to achieve that on more sort of comprehensive governing level without even having that chief trust officer in the organization. So
what is trust governance, and have you looked at mission and vision statements?
Let me answer the second first because it's easier.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one, yes, I examined the organization that had trust officer and then didn't have it. But then when you compare with their mission, vision, and annual reports and public statements with any other organization that never had CTO, there's not much difference. We believe when they left the But they abandoned the idea to have chief trust officer. They actually abandoned the emphasis on trust in their mission and vision. It is still there, but very, very little. There is no strong emphasis on it. So in those organizations, what happened? That role that was meant to evolve, like in the case of Anne and Ellen, and we have the same in Salesforce and PwC, but it's consulting, so it's a bit different. He's consulting multiple companies. When they abandoned that idea, they actually just stopped the evolution because the role evolved in other organizations. It started capturing not only data and security, but also consumer and feedback and sales and everything. But if they didn't want to do that, they simply abandoned the role. So they are addressing trust, but not differently than any other organization.
And what is trust governance?
Trust governance. Well, our meeting this morning was on this topic. So we are forming definition. I would like to say that elements of the definition will be about regulating all points of touch with consumer, but also impacting all elements of trust, including product quality and everything that comes on top of it, such as privacy and everything else we mentioned today. But I would actually like to stay there. I wouldn't like to make any statement at this moment because codes are emerging and categories are emerging. And when I have them all, I'll let you know.
Vasana, Jackie, and Artemis.
So relating to that question and the focus on CTOs, I see governance as a multi-level phenomena, right? It's not just at the top of the organization. And relating back to what Kevin said, maybe we don't have any chief knowledge officers or chief process officers because it's become institutionalized and it's an expectation that middle managers and other people will be looking into. That's one extreme. So my question is, why only focus on the very top level? Or have you also started or considered looking at how trust is an embedded key thing in other managerial positions in the organizations?
That was my question, Marcel. Thank you for saying that much better than I did.
Okay.
As it comes down to is, are you studying chief trust officers or the way an organization governs trust?
No, but the way an organization governs trust when they have chief trust officer. That's
okay,
what the study is
so why
about.
the focus on trust officers, especially when it's so limited?
Because then you have person accountable. Otherwise, it's very dispersed. If I ask you, who is in charge for trust in PUT?
But see, accountability doesn't have to be one single person. If you take an institution, there are different things we are all accountable. I'm not the only person accountable for the ones that I'm accountable for. There are accountability can be shared distributed to some extent. I can see it's a good starting point, but perhaps you might need to consider.
I completely agree with that. And trust me, I was thinking about including both cases in this study. However, when you think about advantages of one person being aware of everything that's done to build trust, that's a very different approach than 20 persons having to communicate about it and transfer their knowledge to each other and meeting each other regularly. That's a very different approach.
It could also be a maturity aspect, right? Sometimes it's a top-down, there's one person kind of dictating or guiding. Sometimes a bubble-up approach where, the top person is positioned later on. There might be two or more different models in how trust is governed in an organization.
I can definitely do another study after this one and do that.
Let's not trivialize it. I mean, if you study trust governance, you can study more or less every single company on this planet.
Yes.
So be really clear. So what we discussed is obviously we study the chief trust officer more than trust governance.
Okay.
Because they're easy to identify. And it's a bit like saying, I study leadership and ask Elon Musk and Bill Gates, as opposed to I study leadership in general. Yeah. So be really, really clear about what we study as a chief trust officer and maybe not trust governance. We study very, very small form that is practiced by very, very few companies right now. And there might be an indication that's great, might be an indication it's not worthwhile. Jackie, and can we get a question that is much shorter than what you wrote, please?
Sorry, I'll ask it if you like. I was just interested in how you defined governance as being the management of management, and then also the contribution of the voice and views of the board in your research, because Chief Trust Officer is part of management and the board has a distinct role. So I'm trying to understand, so that's why the long fumbly questions in the chat. I'm trying to understand what you mean by governance and how that may then frame the research that you're doing and the perspective that you're taking.
So I shared this slide just to remind that Chief Trust Officer is actually part of the C-suite. So they're sitting together with CEO, CFO, etc., and collaboratively creating goals that are relating to trust consumer has in their product, in their etc. So their role is sitting in that board and actually building, identifying those goals, but also communicating with managers and other teams in order to redefine the goals or to redefine the ways to better reach the goals, because they're working collaboratively with managers and teams to implement operations on the operational side to reach the goals set by the board. Is this answering part of your question?
Not really. I think my question is more conceptual in terms of the concept of governance, because the focus is on particular positions that are embedded in the management team. And if somebody is sitting on the board, I think somebody else mentioned earlier, they're reporting to the board, but they're not necessarily governors of the organisation, even if they wear a dual hat. Their role, like, and the way that research seems to be framed, from what I've seen so far, is that it's very much that command and control, whereas a board has a richer, more sort of multi-dimensional contribution to governance of an organisation. So advisory, strategy, creativity, and so on, and perspectives that come from outside the firm.
What CTO is doing, so I don't see the difference between understanding of CTO and the board.
Okay, well, why have a board? If managers can manage a corporation, then why have a board? What does the board do for governance?
I'm not saying managers are managing corporation. I'm saying that CTO is part of the board doing all of those things.
Yeah, but they're also, if the board is managing management and you have a manager on the board, how can a manager manage themselves, particularly when it's a matter of relating to trust, which is so fundamental? The individual directors carry legal responsibility and liability.
Okay, I can see what's the issue. So you don't like the definition of management. That is just the definition that comes when you're explaining governance to someone who heard about it first time. And I just like the definition to explain on which level I'm talking. But yes, you're completely right. Governance is about strategy, about vision, about creativity, but it also, in the case of CTO, means that that's fed from the bottom of organization, meaning from the operational level, with the people who are actually communicating with consumer. Because C-suite members not always can assume what consumer would expect and where would they find potential for improvement. So, yeah.
Let me make it short and sharp. I think there's a lot of homework to be done. What is governance? Artemis, and then was there any other question?
I just have one question.
Artemis, Caroline, but make it short, sharp.
Right.
Question,
I think
short,
a
sharp
very
answers.
important comment. I think you should relabel consumer trust, because trust really means from multiple parties. Trust from your partner organization, trust from your employees. And your comments about no literature, no prior work, that's because trust is not defined. When you look at consumer trust, there's literature. When you look at trust from employees, there's literature. There's literature from employee engagement that equates that to a dollar value. So once trust is narrowed down to a particular type, and in these things, they sound like consumer trust, I strongly recommend you to just phrase it that way so there's no confusion. Then we know what we're talking about.
Good comment. I did refer to consumer trust, but I'm trying to understand how CTO sees it. Do they acknowledge all of this? Because they are focusing.
The idea of CTOs being such a unique role, but if they're only looking at trust from consumers, then it interacts with marketing and sales. So there's other chief officers of sorts that's looking after that group in other organizations. Whereas I would imagine a trust officer will look after all types of trust. And so it's very strange to not look into employees or whatever, then you might as well call them the marketing or sales manager. And so I think that the labeling is super important in defining the scope of what this person is looking at.
Brilliant comment.
Exactly, really good. That's the development potential of the role they don't see at the moment. That's really good.
Caroline, last question.
Oh, so aligned to what Artemis just said, because I asked you at the outset, you know, what's the connection with corporate social responsibility? And I think that consumers' trust, say, for instance, is very much also aligned with how they treat other stakeholders. So, you know, I think that just confining it to, we're looking at consumers, what their feedback is, what our products are. You know, there's already people looking at that to a certain degree, as people have mentioned. Whereas I do see a lot of merit in kind of recognising that the consumer is just one stakeholder and their perceptions are very related to, you know, consumers are making all sorts of decisions at the moment about, you know, does this company deal with climate change? You know, all of those sorts of things, I think really resonate. I think they interact with the consumer.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Ryan has a question from 10 minutes ago. I didn't ask him.
Yeah, sorry, nearly doctor, right? Welcome again, and congratulations to a spectacular event yesterday. So well done.
Sorry if it was a little late. I did sleep in just a little bit.
Yeah.
I actually was really interested. I kind of building on what we're hearing today, and Kevin's really good point is that you have this chief information officer who might be handling privacy and different things. And you have this chief marketing officer handling the product goods and how we communicate them, and an operations person, how well we make the good and how we deliver this good. And so I'm kind of curious how you look at the CEO, who would actually, their job role is so much more about embodying this trust governance. And now they've got somebody to help them to have an accountability. And how you see, I mean, and Kevin brought it up, is that trust person now, their job going to be outsourced like the knowledge officer was? And if that's the CEO's job being focused towards more the financials and trying to offshore that, or how you feel over time, the trust officer role and that trust governance, is trust governance going to be shifted to the CEO and then the CEO can put it on to everybody? Or is this the CEO giving a way to make sure there's accountability with one person?
What I heard from them so far is that CTO is acting in relation to CEOs and CFO, and they're jointly creating trust-related goals. So it's, I would say, almost an equal role. They just gave accountability to that one person, and they told them, look, we are equals, but you should tell us what's happening with trust. We frame these goals together, but then you not only frame it with us and develop a vision and mission, you also collaborate with teams to make it happen.
So you get your chief information officer and your knowledge officer, chief the trust officer to work on that aspect, and then your trust and marketing person on communication of that trust and kind of things. So you have a lot of collaborations.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for this
Kevin
brilliant.
had a last question.
Kevin? Apologies, another week to go.
Can I go ahead? Can I ask my question?
Yes, so can you make it short and sharp? So
Yeah.
Kevin, I think Kevin, okay.
Who's it?
Kevin, but make it short and sharp, please.
Okay, so my question is, so if chief trust officers are the individuals responsible, does every organization need one, and should QUT appoint one?
That's something I want to put in conclusions of my paper. I'll let you know when I develop it. And brilliant question, by the way. And Chip?
Yeah, hi, great presentation, Adele. What I wanted to know is from an entrepreneur side of story, because let's say we're building a new venture, and we are trying to gain trust very quickly from our clients, from our customers, from the market. So is that term agile, which you used in your presentation, is it that agility that we are gaining trust very quickly, very in a dynamic fashion, in an uncertain world? And the goal is to gain the extreme trust for an entrepreneur. And
let me stop you here. This study is about these great, huge corporations and CTO role in governing trust. I definitely wouldn't recommend startups to put a chief trust governor.
No, I'm not saying that.
But
so role could also be a signaling from a major corporation. They are trying to signal that we care about you, but they don't really mean anything. They might be the case as well. They're just signaling that we have a trust officer, so we care about trust, but maybe not. But as a new venture, if you're starting a new venture, how quickly you gain trust? So what are the certain firm behaviors or entrepreneur behaviors you have to demonstrate to gain trust very quickly?
I would leave this to Moschina and Taig. That's their area of expertise, definitely within SP3. That's out of scope of this study.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Thank you so much for joining us, for the tremendous and comprehensive contribution to the conversation. As I highlighted, often when we have a seminar like this, we present answers, artifacts, models, theories, design principles, and we like them or not, and we tear them apart and ask them, can they be generalized? Today I felt the questions were more about the question as opposed to the answer. It seems to be a long way away from the answer. Sometimes when you work with real world, you see questions before anybody else. If you know that Apple or Amazon have someone who's called a chief trust officer, if someone says, I'm in charge of build trust in Alexa, yes, you might call me chief trust officer. Am I chief trust officer for Amazon, or do I ensure that customers trust a device called Alexa? Are complete different questions, of course. So the first time we maybe have a question, or maybe we have an opportunity, we have to ask ourselves, how do I phrase this question? Is it about building consumer trust? And how I build trust in an incredibly trust-intensive solution like Alexa? And this in its own could be a question. It could be, what is trust governance, which is a huge question because governance is discussed comprehensively, and we need to have a crystal clear textbook definition of governance that we teach to every first semester business student. Third, you could say, I study chief trust officer. Now, there are biggest papers written about the role of a chief learning officer, the chief information officer, the chief process officer, in the biggest journals in the world. I just read a paper about the chief learning officer in the HBR. If they exist over 10 years, over 2 years, it's a completely different question. So is this longitudinal or not? Is again a completely different question, as opposed to I study what are the roles and responsibilities of a chief trust officer. And guess what? I talked to 3 of the biggest in the world. HBR would publish this. If we don't phrase exactly what the boundaries of the questions are, we get questions because our questions are clearly enough articulated. We have an oversupply of questions here, but often less is more. And I'd like to highlight again, we teach a lot how to find answers. We are very bad on teaching how to design a research question. And I think that's an area where there's a substantial need guided. And I think you all made tremendous contributions to massively improve this. But the biggest piece of homework is clarity around what's in scope. The question that I would have had is, what is the research question? And how do you know that what you produce is actually true? But we talk about this another time. For the moment being, a bit like yesterday, what I like at QT, that there's a willingness to target big, courageous questions. And I think you did this brilliantly yesterday. Like Ryan, you took an incredibly complicated question. And this is equally. I don't think there are a lot of universities in the world right now talking to chief trust officers. That's the advantage. But that's just necessary, not sufficient to write the most brilliant papers in the world. And then again, we need to find a way of this unique practical access becomes a massive theoretical asset. And again, you've done this brilliantly, but of course, it's a summary of massive PhD work and a massive brain. So with this, again, on behalf of the whole trust team, from all of us, thank you so much for being courageous.
Thank you, guys.
And I wish you a beautiful afternoon. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.